He moved into the neighborhood almost 10 years ago. Back when the streets were quieter and people still waved from their driveways, the houses all looked similar, but each family made small changes to feel at home. Some planted flowers, some painted their doors, some built small sitting areas in their yards. It was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened, and that was exactly why he liked it. He was not a loud person. He worked long hours, kept his lawn trimmed, paid his bills on time, and minded his own business. Most neighbors knew him as the man who left early in the morning and came home just before sunset. He smiled politely, helped carry groceries when asked, and stayed out of neighborhood drama. For years, life stayed simple. The Homeowners Association existed back then too, but it barely made noise. Once or twice a year, they sent newsletters reminding people about trash days or parking rules. No one complained much. The board members were older residents who seemed more interested in keeping peace than enforcing power. That changed the year the new board took over. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. A few new faces appeared at the monthly meetings. They spoke with confidence and promised to restore order and raise standards. Most residents did not attend meetings, so the changes passed without much discussion. New rules were added, old ones rewritten, and fines increased. Still, no one thought it would affect them personally. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a thin, white envelope taped to his door. He found it one evening after work. The paper inside claimed his trash bins were visible from the street outside approved hours. He stood there reading it twice, confused. His bins were behind a wooden fence, the same way they had always been. He assumed it was a mistake. Maybe the notice was meant for someone else. He shrugged, folded the paper, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. A week later, another notice arrived. This one said his lawn edges were uneven and violated appearance rules. He walked outside, looked around, and saw nothing different from the neighboring yards. In fact, some lawns nearby were clearly worse. Again, he chose not to react. Complaining felt like unnecessary stress. Then the tone changed. The third letter mentioned fines. The language was colder, more official, and less friendly. It warned of penalties if non-compliance continued. That word stuck in his mind. It felt heavy, like he had done something wrong. Even though he knew he hadn't, he finally decided to attend an HOA meeting. The room was filled with folding chairs and quiet tension. The new board sat at the front table, papers neatly stacked, expression serious. When it was his turn to speak, he calmly explained the notices and asked for clarification. One board member cut him off mid-sentence. Another spoke in a firm voice, saying rules were rules and exceptions would not be made. No one explained what exactly he needed to fix. He left the meeting with more questions than answers. Over the next month, the notices continued. Small things. A decorative item in the yard that had been there for years. A claim about paint color fading that no one else had mentioned before. Each letter felt less like maintenance and more like pressure. Neighbors started whispering. Some warned him quietly to be careful. Others said it was best to just pay and stay quiet. A few admitted they had received similar notices but fixed the issues quickly to avoid trouble. No one wanted to be a target. He started keeping records. Every letter went into a folder. Dates, times, photos of his property before and after notices. He wasn't angry yet, just cautious. Something felt off. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules evenly. They were focusing on certain homes, certain people. One afternoon, he noticed someone standing across the street taking pictures of his house. The person didn't introduce themselves. Just took photos, wrote something down, and left. That was the moment the calm feeling he once had fully disappeared. His home no longer felt private. Still, he stayed calm. He knew arguing would only make things worse. He responded to notices politely, asking for written explanations. Most messages went unanswered. When replies did come, they were short and dismissive. The pressure slowly crept into his daily life. He checked the mailbox with a tight feeling in his chest. He adjusted things around his house that never bothered anyone before. He stopped sitting outside in the evenings. Even sleep became lighter. interrupted by thoughts of fines and threats. What the HOA did not know was that he was not unfamiliar with pressure. His job had trained him to stay calm under stress, to observe before reacting, and to document everything carefully. He had dealt with people who tried to intimidate before. This situation felt smaller than those, but the pattern was familiar. One evening, another letter arrived, this one more aggressive than the rest. It claimed repeated violations and warned of further action. No details. No proof. Just threats. That was when he realized this was no longer about rules. It was about control. He sat at his kitchen table, reading the letter slowly. He didn't tear it up. He didn't get angry. Instead, he placed it neatly into the folder with the others. He opened his laptop and began organizing everything by date. Photos, emails, notices, meeting notes, outside. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Kids rode bikes. Porch lights flickered on. Life went on. Aware of the quiet conflict unfolding behind one front door, he knew this was only the beginning. The HOA believed he would eventually break. Pay up or move away. They believed he was just another quiet homeowner who wouldn't push back. They were wrong. As he closed the folder and turned off the lights, he made a simple decision. He would not escalate. He would not threaten. He would let them continue, gather more proof, and wait. Because sometimes the loudest response is patience, and sometimes people only realize their mistake, and they have already gone too far. He thought the first wave of letters and small threats would be the worst of it. But soon, the HOA began taking things further. At first it was subtle. A board member appeared at the mailbox while he was collecting the mail, asking questions in a tone that was meant to feel casual but was heavy with judgment. "Is that all the letters you've been getting?" the person asked, peering at him over the top of sunglasses. He smiled politely and said yes, hoping the interaction would end there. It didn't. Within days, someone from the HOA showed up at his driveway, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of his yard. He stepped outside and asked what they were doing. The board member spoke slowly, almost theatrically, about documenting property standards and ensuring the community remains beautiful. When he pointed out that everything on his property was within the rules, the board member shrugged and said it was subjective, and for the record, that phrase stuck in his mind. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. Neighbors began noticing the tension. Some walked past and gave sympathetic smiles. Others looked away, afraid to be involved. Word spread that the new HOA board had been visiting certain homes repeatedly, taking notes and issuing fines over minor details. Some of these details were so trivial they seemed absurd: garden hoses not coiled perfectly, a mailbox slightly tilted, a swing set that hadn't been wiped down. It was clear that the board enjoyed exerting power over people. The homeowner quickly realized he was now a target. At first, he tried to handle it quietly. He responded politely to emails and letters, asking for clarification and explanations. Most of the time, the HOA ignored his requests. When they did respond, it was short, vague, and dismissive. He realized that no reasoning or explanation would stop them. Their goal was not fairness. Their goal was intimidation. One afternoon, as he was trimming his hedges, he noticed a neighbor across the street staring and taking photos. The man waved when he caught his eye, but did not stop. It was clear he was reporting something back to the HOA. That's when the homeowner realized that harassment was not just limited to official letters or visits. Someone was actively watching him. His yard, once a place of relaxation, now felt like a stage where every move was scrutinized. He began documenting everything meticulously. Each letter, each visit, each suspicious glance from the street went into a detailed log. Photos were time-stamped. Notes were made about conversations and behaviors. He was careful, not aggressive. He understood that if this escalated, he would need proof, not anger. The HOA's tactics grew bolder. One morning, he found a notice on his door claiming he had violated a rule about the color of his front door trim. The absurdity of the claim caught him off guard. The trim was a neutral color that had never caused a problem before. No one else on the block had received a notice about similar trim colors. This was personal. They were singling him out. At a neighborhood meeting, he attended to address the growing tension. The room was crowded, more than he had expected. The new board members sat at the front with papers stacked neatly, expressions tight. When it was his turn to speak, he explained the notices, the visits, and the harassment. He calmly asked for clarification. The response was shocking. One board member interrupted, saying that everyone was entitled to their opinion and that the rules were clear. Another raised a hand, pointing to the back of the room, insisting that he was deflecting responsibility. They spoke over him, dismissing his points. By the end of the meeting, it was clear the board did not intend to resolve anything. They were trying to publicly shame him. After that meeting, the situation intensified. The board began sending letters threatening legal action. One claimed that if he didn't correct his property immediately, they would impose fines that could accumulate daily. Another mentioned the possibility of further proceedings without specifying what those would be. It was intimidation masked as procedure. Despite the stress, he maintained his composure. He did not argue or yell. He did not threaten. He stayed calm and continued documenting everything. He knew that losing his temper would give the board more ammunition. Patience became his strategy. The HOA's next tactic was even more invasive. One morning, a board member appeared unannounced at his driveway with a contractor in tow, claiming they needed to inspect his property for compliance. He told them politely that no one was allowed on his property without permission. The board member argued, raising his voice, but the homeowner stood firm. He refused entry and asked them to leave. The board member left, muttering under his breath. But the point was clear. They were testing boundaries. It wasn't just the letters or the visits that weighed on him. It was the constant uncertainty, the feeling of being watched. It's the knowledge that any small misstep could trigger a new wave of harassment. Even friends and neighbors noticed the change in his demeanor. He seemed tense, cautious, almost always alert. But he never showed fear openly. He knew that fear was exactly what the HOA wanted. As days turned into weeks, he continued to observe. Every interaction, every notice, every suspicious look from the street became part of a larger picture. He could see the patterns. The HOA picked targets carefully, escalating pressure gradually to break people down. They counted on people either moving away or quietly complying. He realized he would not be broken. One evening, while reviewing his records, he noticed that the HOA had begun using slightly different tactics. Instead of letters, they were sending notices via email, sometimes copying neighbors or other board members. They began making vague claims about community standards that were impossible to measure. It was psychological warfare, slow erosion of confidence. He understood something important in that moment. This was bigger than his house or yard. This was about principles. Standing up calmly, documenting carefully, and not giving in would show them that intimidation could fail. The next step for the HOA is almost comical if it hadn't been so frustrating. They accused him of leaving his garbage cans out in a way that spoiled the neighborhood aesthetic and even suggested neighbors could report him directly. It was absurd, petty, and invasive. But by then, he had become immune to their theatrics. He kept his records, took photos, and quietly continued his life. By the end of part 2, he had transformed from a quiet homeowner into a careful strategist. He was no longer just responding to harassment. He was watching, documenting, and learning. The HOA had revealed their methods, and he was preparing for what would come next. The tension in the neighborhood grew, but he never let it consume him. He understood that power could be abused, but patience, documentation, and calmness could counter it. Every letter, every visit, every subtle threat was now part of a larger story. A story that he was determined to write on his own terms, and quietly. He began to realize that if the HOA continued pushing, they were walking into a mistake that could have serious consequences for them. Not him. The months of careful observation, letters, and subtle intimidation had built a quiet storm around him. At first, it seemed like minor annoyances, letters about garden hoses, driveway cracks, and mailbox tilts. But now, the harassment had crossed into something more serious. The HOA no longer relied on subtle threats. They had started pushing boundaries that he knew were legally questionable. It began with a notice slipped under his door one morning. The paper was typed, formal, and contained words that made his stomach tighten. They accused him of violating a rule about the type of fencing he had in his backyard, something that had existed for years without issue. The letter demanded immediate correction and implied that fines would escalate daily. There was no citation, no clause, no legal reference, just threats. He read it carefully, noting the date and time, and filed it with the others. Within days, a board member appeared at his property unannounced. This time, they claimed they needed to inspect the fence to ensure it met community standards. He politely told them that no one was allowed on his property without permission. The board member argued, waving the letter in his face and insisting it was a legal request. He stood firm. The situation could have escalated, but he kept his calm, documented the encounter, and waited for them to leave. They did, though muttering and casting glances that betrayed frustration. It became clear that the HOA was no longer following proper procedure. They had started making direct accusations, spreading misinformation to neighbors, and attempting to intimidate him into compliance. One afternoon, a neighbor approached him nervously, explaining that a board member had claimed he was violating numerous rules, and that neighbors were being encouraged to report him. The homeowner felt a mix of frustration and determination. He realized the board was not acting in the interest of the community. They were using fear and misinformation as tools of control. He started reviewing HOA rules meticulously, comparing them to past actions and letters. The more he looked, the clearer it became that the board had been selective and inconsistent. Certain homes were being scrutinized constantly, while others were ignored for the same minor issues. The pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't about rules. It was about power. One evening, he attended another HOA meeting, this time prepared with his notes, emails, photographs, and copies of every notice he had received. The room was crowded, as usual, and the board members looked confident and composed. He stood up and calmly presented the inconsistencies, pointing out rules that were vague or unenforced elsewhere, and showing documentation of every encounter, visit, and letter. The reaction was immediate. One board member raised a hand and accused him of cherry-picking rules to suit himself. Another said he was trying to intimidate the board. The room grew tense, neighbors murmuring uneasily. He did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply presented the facts, one by one, and waited. After the meeting, the subtle intimidation tactics escalated. Letters turned into formal warnings with legal-sounding language. They threatened daily fines, liens on property, and further action without specifying what that meant. The tone of the correspondence had become aggressive, almost hostile. He read each one carefully, filed them, and did not respond impulsively. Patience had become his weapon. Around this time, he noticed someone photographing his property from across the street almost daily. It was no longer about letters or meetings, it was surveillance. His home, once a place of peace, now felt like a monitored site. Yet he refused to react in anger. He began documenting the surveillance too, noting times, locations, and actions. The homeowner also began speaking quietly with neighbors who had experienced similar harassment. Some had already paid fines or made changes unnecessarily, believing it would stop the pressure. Others were still quietly resisting, but feeling stressed and isolated. He realized the HOA relied on fear, using the community as a tool to enforce their will. One day, the board took a step that crossed an important line. They tried to enter his property without consent, claiming they needed to inspect for compliance. This was no longer a polite request. It was an attempt to assert control over his home directly. He politely but firmly denied them entry, explaining that they had no legal right to enter without permission. They left. But the intent was clear. The board wanted to assert dominance and make him feel powerless. Even as the harassment grew, he remained calm. He focused on documenting everything, preparing for any eventuality. Every letter, visit, and conversation was carefully logged. Photos, emails, and notes filled folders and spreadsheets. He knew that if this escalated further, having a clear record would be essential. During this period, he also began noticing patterns in the board's behavior. They tended to act aggressively when residents were alone, relied on vague language and notices, and selectively applied rules. They encouraged neighbors to report him, creating a false narrative of widespread complaints. He realized that intimidation, not fairness, drove the HOA's actions. Late one evening, while reviewing all his documentation, he reflected on how much the situation had changed his life. Once, he could leave his home without thought, relax in his yard, and trust his neighbors. Now, every notice and visit carried weight. Every interaction felt like a test, and every move was scrutinized. But he also realized that he had gained something valuable: knowledge. He understood how the board operated, their weaknesses, the pattern of escalation. He began preparing for the moment when he would no longer be reactive. He needed a strategy that would protect his home, assert his rights, and expose the HOA's misconduct. This was no longer about compliance or polite requests. It was about standing firm, calmly, legally, and strategically. Neighbors began noticing subtle changes too. Some admired his composure, though they did not speak openly. Others were quietly relieved that someone was keeping careful records and not allowing the HOA to get away with harassment. Slow. Why? A network of quiet support began to form, though it remained unspoken. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their harassment, oblivious to the preparation happening behind the doors they thought they controlled. Every letter, every visit, every threat added to a growing body of evidence that the homeowner meticulously maintained. He was learning, step by step, the limits of their authority and the vulnerabilities in their approach. By the end of this period, he had transformed from a quiet, compliant homeowner into a careful strategist. The letters and visits, once stressful, now served as documentation of their misconduct. Every interaction, every accusation, every attempt at intimidation was logged and preserved. He understood something crucial. The board had overstepped. Their tactics were not sustainable. Their power depended on fear, uncertainty, and silence. He had none of these. He was calm, prepared, and documenting every step. He knew that if he continued to act strategically, he could shift the balance of power. The tension in the neighborhood remained, but he was no longer just a target. He had become an observer, a recorder, and a strategist. He knew the rules, he knew the patterns, and he knew his rights. The HOA's harassment had not broken him. It had taught him how to stand firm, how to prepare, how to respond when the moment came, and quietly, in the back of his mind, he realized that the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. They believed he was just another quiet homeowner, someone they could pressure and intimidate. They were about to learn in time that patience, preparation, and calm resolve were stronger than any intimidation tactic they could throw at him. He continued to live his life, quiet and composed, never reacting impulsively. Every letter, visit, and confrontation was now part of a larger plan. The board had revealed their methods and weaknesses without realizing it. And when the time came, he would be ready. He closed his folder of documents, glanced around his home, and allowed himself a brief moment of quiet reflection. The situation had grown tense, stressful, and sometimes absurd. But he was learning something valuable. When someone abuses power, preparation, calmness, and knowledge can be the most powerful tools of all. The HOA believed they were in control. They did not realize that their behavior had set the stage for a moment they could never have predicted. The homeowner was no longer reacting to their harassment. He was preparing for a response that would change everything. The neighborhood might have seemed calm on the surface, but beneath it, a quiet confrontation was brewing. And he was ready, patient, and entirely composed. The HOA had been escalating for months. Letters arrived almost daily now, some vague, some threatening, all carefully worded to create fear and pressure. Visits to the house had increased, some unannounced, some supposedly scheduled, though they rarely bothered to communicate properly. Every minor detail of his property had been scrutinized, criticized, or outright misrepresented in their records. What had once been subtle intimidation was now becoming openly aggressive. He had spent months documenting everything. Each notice, each interaction, each suspicious glance from the street was carefully logged. Photos were time-stamped, conversations noted with exact words remembered as best as possible. Emails were copied, organized, and backed up. Every instance of harassment became evidence. He was calm, methodical, and patient, knowing that patience had been the strongest tool against the HOA's tactics so far. Then came the meeting that would mark the turning point. It was scheduled as a standard HOA meeting, but he could feel the tension building in the neighborhood for days before. Notices had been sent to residents, subtly hinting at a discussion of ongoing violations. When he arrived, the room was unusually full. Chairs were pushed close together. Neighbors whispered in corners. And the board members sat at the head table, confident, almost smug. The meeting started with the usual formalities. The HOA president spoke about maintaining community standards and ensuring fairness. But soon, the focus shifted to him. A list of violations had been prepared, printed neatly, and handed to attendees. They included minor items like the angle of his mailbox, the condition of a garden ornament, and vague accusations about yard maintenance. None of it was new. Most had been addressed in his documentation. But the board presented it as though he had ignored repeated warnings. Hoping the audience would see him as negligent, he remained seated, reviewing the list quietly. His notes and photos were organized in his mind. Each accusation could be countered with proof. The board assumed he would panic, argue, or become defensive. Instead, he stayed calm. The atmosphere grew tense as neighbors watched, unsure how he would respond. When his turn to speak came, he stood slowly, deliberately, and addressed the room. He began by calmly pointing out inconsistencies in the board's accusations. He referenced exact dates, letters, and previous communications. He showed photos comparing his property to the rules cited in the violations. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply presented the facts, clearly and systematically. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others tried to interrupt, insisting he was deflecting responsibility. He ignored the interruptions, continuing to outline the truth. For each claim, he showed evidence, letters with incorrect dates, photos showing compliance, and emails where he had politely requested clarification. The room was silent, neighbors leaning in, curious and surprised. Then, he did something the board did not expect. From inside his coat pocket, he produced an official federal identification badge. He did not wave it aggressively or brandish it to intimidate. He simply held it up, calmly, and identified himself by title. The reaction in the room was immediate. Whispered exchanges between board members, eyes widening, hands nervously shifting on papers. The confident, smug demeanor of the HOA dissolved almost instantly. The presence of his badge did not mean he intended to punish anyone. It was a simple fact. He held a federal position, and the board's behavior had already crossed lines that were legally significant. Their attempts at intimidation and misrepresentation were no longer abstract. They could have serious consequences. For a few moments, no one spoke. The board member's attempts to maintain authority had vanished. He continued speaking, calmly reiterating the facts, referencing documentation, and explaining that he had acted with patience and restraint despite the harassment. He emphasized that he had never abused his position, never threatened anyone, and had only defended his property and rights. A hush fell over the room. Neighbors who had quietly been observing realized the severity of the situation. The HOA's pattern of harassment, the selective enforcement, and the baseless accusations were now exposed in a way that could not be ignored. The board attempted to regain control, muttering about rules and procedures. He listened patiently, allowing them to speak, documenting every statement silently in his mind. Then, he addressed the room once more, reminding everyone of the importance of fairness, transparency, and respecting property rights. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally, but with authority that could not be denied. The rest of the meeting unfolded differently. Instead of continued public accusations, the board members began to hesitate. They avoided direct eye contact. Statements became quieter, more cautious. The energy shifted from aggression to defensiveness. He maintained composure, never pressing his position aggressively, but the room had changed. The tone was no longer about intimidation. It was about damage control. After the meeting, neighbors approached him quietly. Some thanked him for standing firm. Others admitted they had been afraid to speak up against the board but now felt relief and validation. The dynamic in the neighborhood shifted subtly but significantly. People began to see that the HOA's behavior had been excessive, that they had overstepped, and that calm, methodical defense could expose wrongdoing without confrontation. The board itself began to unravel over the following weeks. Legal advisors were quietly contacted. Questions were raised about the legitimacy of fines and the process used to issue notices. Some board members quietly stepped down or sought to avoid direct involvement with him. The harassment did not vanish immediately, but it slowed considerably. The board had learned the hard way that their approach had limits. He never used his position to punish or humiliate anyone. He did not call federal authorities on his neighbors or the board. He simply presented facts, identified himself properly, and let the natural consequences of overreach occur. The transformation in the neighborhood was subtle but real. Fear and intimidation lost their power, replaced by respect for calm, principled action at home, reflected on the months of tension and harassment. The letters, visits, and threats had been stressful, but they had also revealed important truths about the HOA, about human behavior under perceived authority, and about his own capacity for patience and strategic thinking. His home, once a place of stress, had returned to being a place of quiet pride. Neighbors began approaching him more openly, asking questions about the process, sharing their own experiences, and quietly expressing relief that someone had stood up. Some started documenting interactions with the HOA themselves, inspired by his methodical approach. The neighborhood, once tense and uncertain, began to feel more transparent and fair. He understood that power had been misused, but he also understood that it could be countered. Calmness, documentation, patience, and clear communication had turned months of harassment into an opportunity to restore fairness and respect. By the end of this turning point, the HOA was no longer the confident, aggressive force it had been. Board members acted more cautiously. The atmosphere in meetings shifted from tension to careful negotiation. Neighbors felt safer, and the culture of intimidation began to fade. The homeowner's life returned to a semblance of normal. He continued to maintain his property, engage politely with neighbors, and follow the rules. But he now carried the quiet knowledge that calm, principled action could prevail against bullying and abuse. He had faced months of pressure, surveillance, threats, and false accusations. Yet through preparation, patience, and strategic calm, he had reached a turning point that would define the neighborhood's future. The board had learned that intimidation could fail. Fear had been neutralized not through confrontation, but through methodical, honest, and calm defense of rights. The story was far from over, but the landscape had changed. What had started as minor letters and subtle threats had escalated to public confrontation. In that room, with neighbors watching and the HOA exposed, the homeowner had quietly but firmly reclaimed the balance of power. He knew that moving forward, vigilance was necessary. But the turning point had been reached. The HOA could no longer bully, and the neighborhood could finally breathe a little easier. Calmness, strategy, and truth had triumphed where anger or aggression might have failed. And quietly, as he walked home from the meeting, he felt a sense of satisfaction not from power, but from knowing that standing firm with integrity and patience could change the course of events, protect a home, and restore fairness to a community. The weeks after the turning point passed slowly but surely. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for months began to ease, though not completely. The HOA had been shaken. The board members who had once acted with confidence now spoke in careful, measured tones. They avoided direct confrontation, and their aggressive letters had stopped almost entirely. The neighborhood had begun to understand the seriousness of the situation, though no one spoke about it openly. For the homeowner, life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Mornings were quiet again, and he could walk around his yard without glancing over his shoulder. He continued his meticulous record-keeping, though now it felt more like a precaution than a necessity. The documentation that had once been a shield now served as a reminder of how important preparation and calm could be when facing unjust pressure. Neighbors started to approach him quietly, often with hesitant smiles. Some admitted that they had been intimidated themselves and had paid fines or made unnecessary changes to avoid attention. Others confessed that they had been afraid to speak up at meetings. He listened patiently, offering reassurance but no judgment. He explained that standing firm with patience and careful preparation was far more effective than reacting impulsively or giving in to fear. The HOA slowly began to restructure itself. Some of the original board members who had been the most aggressive quietly resigned. New members, more cautious and aware of the limits of their authority, began to take over. The remaining board members seemed to have learned a lesson. The misuse of power could be exposed and have consequences. Meetings were calmer, rules were enforced fairly, and letters were factual rather than threatening. He continued attending meetings occasionally, though he no longer feared confrontation. When the new board members spoke, he listened politely, offering clarification when necessary, but never asserting authority. His presence alone reminded everyone that the previous culture of intimidation had changed. Neighbors began to participate more openly, and the sense of community slowly returned. Despite the resolution, he never forgot the lessons of the past months. The stress, the letters, and the unannounced visits had left a mark. He understood now that some people sought control not through reason or fairness, but through fear and intimidation. But he had learned that calmness, patience, and methodical documentation were stronger than fear and aggression. He also reflected on his own role. At no point had he abused his authority, threatened anyone, or escalated the conflict unnecessarily. He had acted calmly, presented facts, and allowed the natural consequences of overreach to take effect. This approach had not only protected his home, but also restored fairness and trust within the neighborhood. Some neighbors, inspired by his approach, began documenting their own interactions with the HOA. They realized that knowledge, preparation, and calm communication could protect them from unnecessary harassment. The culture of fear that had dominated for months began to fade, replaced by cautious respect for rules and mutual consideration. The homeowner's relationship with neighbors quietly improved. People who had once avoided interaction now greeted him more openly. Conversations at the mailbox were friendly, and small gestures of support appeared, neighbors helping each other with yard work, sharing tools and exchanging information about community events. The sense of isolation that had accompanied the harassment began to disappear. While the HOA no longer used intimidation as a tool, he remained vigilant. He continued to maintain his records and monitor correspondence. Understanding that vigilance was necessary to prevent future abuse of power, the experience had taught him that calm, consistent action combined with careful documentation could prevent escalation and protect personal rights. Life slowly returned to routine. He resumed quiet evenings on his porch, watching the street, greeting neighbors, and enjoying the sense of safety that had once seemed lost. The yard, once a place of anxiety, became a sanctuary again. The home, once under pressure, now felt secure. Over time, he noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood's culture. The fear and whispers that had spread during the harassment were replaced by cautious openness. Neighbors began to support each other, understanding that community was stronger when intimidation was not tolerated. The HOA, under new leadership, enforced rules fairly and consistently, and residents felt more confident in their rights and responsibilities. He also reflected on the personal growth that had come from the experience. The months of tension had tested patience, strategy, and resilience. They had reinforced the importance of careful observation, methodical documentation, and calm communication. He understood now that these tools were not just useful for dealing with the HOA. They were applicable in many areas of life where unfairness or intimidation could arise. The final outcome of the conflict was clear. The HOA had overstepped. The homeowner had defended his rights without aggression, and the neighborhood had regained a sense of fairness and security. The board members who had attempted to intimidate him faced the consequences of their actions, quietly stepping down or adjusting behavior while he emerged unbroken, respected, and vindicated. The story of those months quietly spread among neighbors. People shared lessons about the importance of knowing their rights, documenting interactions, and maintaining calm under pressure. The homeowner never sought attention or praise, but his actions became a model for measured, principled response to harassment. Looking back, he understood the importance of boundaries, respect, and preparation. The letters, visits, and threats had been stressful, but they had revealed truths about human behavior, authority, and resilience. They had also shown that intimidation could be countered without confrontation, and that patience and careful action were often more powerful than anger or force. As the months turned to years, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The streets were quiet again, neighbors greeted each other openly, and the community felt safer. The HOA functioned as a governing body rather than an instrument of fear. Residents had learned that knowledge, patience, and calm action could prevent abuse of power. The homeowner continued to maintain his property, engage politely with neighbors, and attend meetings when necessary, always aware of the lessons learned. The experience had reinforced the value of integrity, careful preparation, and calm resilience in the face of intimidation. In the end, the HOA drama became a story not just of conflict, but of personal growth, community resilience, and the power of calm, principled action. The homeowner had stood firm, defended his rights, and helped restore fairness and respect within the neighborhood. The lessons extended beyond the immediate conflict, demonstrating that even in challenging situations, patience, documentation, and integrity could change the outcome. The neighborhood had changed, but so had he. And as he looked around his home, neighbors waving from their porches, children riding bikes, and flowers blooming in the yards, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The struggle had been difficult, but it had strengthened not only his resolve but the community itself. The HOA had learned a lesson about overreach. The neighborhood had learned a lesson about resilience and support. And the homeowner, through careful, calm, and principled action, had ensured that his home, his rights, and his peace were preserved. No threats, no intimidation, and no letters could take that away.